pleasure to be here today. And what I want to do is talk to you actually about one case study application. We do at the Water and Climate Resilience Center, we actually do a lot of work focused on the intersection of climate and water resources. So actually focusing on water supply and demand, water quality impacts, coastal resilience, flood risks, oceans management, and then we also focus on community impacts as well. But what I want to do today is talk particularly about one example of coastal resilience, so thinking about climate impacts on the coast, looking at long-term planning, which is a lot of our focus, walk you through a planning effort that we help support for the state of Louisiana, and then we can actually connect that to some other work that we're doing or have recently completed at RAND that uses a similar set of approaches focused on some of these other topic areas. So feel free to ask questions beyond the example that I'm providing. All right, so as you, I'm sure, heard this morning, coastal areas are among the most at risk in terms of climate impacts. And these come from a variety of different sources when we're thinking about the coasts. One of the most important ones is rising sea levels, the sea level rise that we've seen over the last century, and the accelerating sea level rise that we're expecting to see over the coming years and decades. Coupled with that, but also happening independently, is the loss of coastal land, wetlands, and other coastal features. So in part, that can be driven by sea level rise, but that also is happening due to land subsidence or compaction and sort of natural geologic processes that happen in conjunction with this. And in many areas, as I'll describe, that subsidence can be as important or more important of a factor as well, at least in recent years. And then finally, still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of debate over this, but there's also potential changes in the frequency and intensity of coastal storms as they strike the coast. So that uncertainty plays out when we think about long-term planning and coastal adaptation. So the example that I wanted to talk with you about today focuses on the state of Louisiana. And this whole process really began in 2005 after the devastating hurricane season with hurricanes Katrina and Rita in Louisiana. Now, flood risk is well known in coastal Louisiana. This is not a new problem, and this is not strictly a climate problem, but it's one that really got the state galvanized into action after 2005. And it's coupled with another serious problem related to land subsidence, as I had mentioned. So Louisiana has one of the largest and most productive coastal wetlands ecosystems in the world. And over the last 80 to 90 years, basically since we started putting levees on the Mississippi River, this ecosystem has been disappearing. Now, in large part, that's due to the fact that we've leveed the Mississippi River, and natural processes that used to allow flooding to essentially create the entire delta and for the river to wander back and forth have stopped. And so now most of the water, essentially, or most of the water and the sediment it carries gets dumped out into the deep Gulf of Mexico. So that process, and there's a whole series of drivers associated with that, both in terms of leveeing the Mississippi, natural land compaction and subsidence, and then other human-caused changes to the coast have led to this substantial land loss. So the number is, it's about 1,900, and it's probably more than that at this point because this is a few years old. 1,900 square miles of land have been lost over the last 80 to 90 years, roughly the state of Delaware. And the expectation is that between 800 and 1,800 additional square miles of land would be lost over the next 50 years if no action is taken. So this map shows just all the areas in red that could convert to open water without additional action. Similarly, thinking about flood risk, we find a similar pattern where both that coastal land loss and the coastal wetlands loss, which in turn makes the communities on the coast more vulnerable to flooding, and then the actual effect of sea level rise on flood elevations can lead to substantial changes in what our expected flooding from future storms might be. So this is one example. We're looking at the 1% annual chance, or the 100-year flood depth, 50 years from now in one scenario of the future, taking into account coastal land subsidence and sea level rise. And what we can see is, without additional action, we could get anywhere from 2 feet at the low end in terms of additional floodwaters from a 100-year event, and upwards of 8 feet in some areas as well. And this is just over the next 50 years. So a substantial increase in what you might think of as that sort of typical planning or 100-year event. We see that play out in the science as well. So Louisiana had this substantial and essentially twin challenge of coastal land loss and flood risk. Now again, as I said, this is not a new problem. They've known about this for decades. But what really happened in 2005 is a realization that this is a problem that needs to be addressed at scale. This is not something that could be done with a pilot here or a few acres of coastal restoration there. It needed something that required a comprehensive and coast-wide solution. And a lot of challenges to overcome doing that. There were hundreds of projects that people had proposed for Louisiana, many of which had been authorized but not funded or had been at some stage of project planning. A lot of diverse and conflicting goals in the region. Significant uncertainty, and this is particularly related to climate change, as we think about the way that sea level rise and other drivers would affect these coastal processes. And finally, they lacked the basic science to understand how does the whole coast work together as a system, both the ecological and the landscape side, as well as the human side and coastal communities. How does this all work together as a system? And if we intervene at a large scale on the coast, what is that going to mean? What will it do? So this lack of science about future change. So what the state did is after 2005, started up a new agency in the governor's office, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, brought some people together from other agencies within this, and essentially gave them this dual mandate of planning for coastal wetlands and also thinking about flood risk. So essentially all coastal affairs were brought into the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. And the legislature also mandated that they develop a 50-year master plan and that they update that master plan every 5 years. So this process began, the first master plan was sort of goal setting in 2007. But 2012 is the first plan that actually operationalized a lot of these ideas and brought in a full-scale 50-year investment plan. A couple of key things that were developed for this plan, and RAND, along with a variety of other organizations, helped to support the development of this plan, actually in both aspects I'll describe. So one element was systems modeling. So thinking about the coastal system as a whole, and especially looking at future uncertainty, trying to understand how do we bring these uncertain future scenarios into this entire system and understand what vulnerability might be across a wide range of domains. So thinking about that new systems modeling, both in terms of future uncertainty, as well as the potential benefits from different interventions. And then second, given how many projects were proposed and how many different options there was a new framework that we helped to develop to help identify effective investments and really carefully consider trade-offs. So just to give you a quick sense of the kinds of projects we were looking at here, one set was primarily focused on the ecosystem and thinking about restoring either building land or restoring natural processes. So a couple big ones here. One is called sometimes mechanical marsh creation. This is literally taking pipes or other mechanical means to take sediment or mud from one place and deposit it elsewhere. As you can imagine, this is very costly and very intensive to do, and you can kind of see an example here because you have to literally build acre by acre these reconstructed wetlands. So the other option, and this is particularly so for coastal Louisiana, are river diversions. Essentially taking that leveed Mississippi or its distributaries, the other rivers that come off, and actually starting to build gates on those levees to allow for floodwaters, especially during high flow and flood periods, to come back into the system. And the idea is that this is in part restoring the natural processes that built coastal land in the first place, and that this over the long term could help to nourish and then sustain coastal land that is rapidly eroding away. So in terms of flood risk, this is a couple different pieces, and you'll probably recognize most of this. So what the state considered was both structural flood risk reduction. So here structural, we mean big structures, infrastructure like levees, T-walls, floodgates, and pumps. And then also what the Corps of Engineers sometimes calls non-structural risk reduction, which is also referred to as hazard mitigation. So this would be interventions for individual structures to make them less prone to damage from flooding. And that includes raising single-family homes, flood-proofing of residential or commercial structures, and then in some cases, voluntary structure acquisition. So this overall process, which I'm going to summarize very briefly, used essentially all of this scientific information, including all the uncertainty and evaluation of hundreds of different projects across the coast, and used an iterative approach that was designed to bring that science in with the decision makers in the state of Louisiana and a series of key stakeholders they brought together to actually interact with the science, go through an iterative process, and come up with a consensus 50-year plan. And this worked basically by combining all this information together, a series of interactive visualizations. There was a 6-month period that we were meeting very intensively. They were deliberating over what they were seeing and actually providing feedback to say, okay, well, we want to see a different budget. We want to think about resolving these trade-offs differently. What would the plan look like if we made a different assumption? And through that iterative process, eventually settled on a 50-year and actually $50 billion price tag plan. So this plan is unprecedented, certainly for Louisiana, and is relatively novel in terms of coastal planning at this scale. So first, the price tag is quite large. $50 billion is a substantial investment, far beyond what's gone into the coast in the past. And notably here are two things. One is that about $30 billion of that goes directly to coastal restoration. So more than half is actually focused on marsh creation, on these river diversions, and then other restoration projects. Another notable feature is the major focus on non-structural risk reduction. So about $10 billion of that 50 goes to hazard mitigation, reaching out to communities, and more localized investments in resilience and non-structural risk reduction. If you were to look at this pie chart for investments in coastal Louisiana before 2012, basically the purple wedge, the structural, would be dominant over everything else. We've spent the vast majority of our funds in the past building structural projects. So what would the plan do? So as I said, this was a substantial modeling effort. We looked at the individual project level, and then we thought about the master plan as a whole. And what we find is, in terms of flood risk, this is essentially what we see moving into the future if we don't take additional action. Under current conditions in 2012, we estimated about $2 billion of expected annual damage. So that's kind of average annual damage. And so that's thinking about across the entire range of coastal storm events, what is the average that one would expect? This is often used in insurance planning. So what we see is about $2 billion you'd expect on average each year under current conditions. And when we look 50 years out, depending on the scenario we look at, we see an increase about threefold up to above $7 billion, or actually closer to tenfold, above $20 billion, depending on the scenario. So as you can see, this makes a huge difference in terms of what sea level rise assumption you make, how quickly these processes are playing out, and that range of uncertainty is extremely important when considering the performance of this type of plan. Now, with the master plan, what we found when we looked at the plan projects that were identified is actually we're not able to reduce risk down to zero, so it's always going to be there, and it does still creep up. But what we see is substantial reduction in flood risk across both of these planning scenarios that we looked at. So here, keeping it relatively constant under a moderate, and then it increases, but at a much lower rate for the less optimistic scenario. Now, similarly, looking at one of the other main goals, which is coastal land and land loss, what we saw in the future with that action is that land loss is just going to continue on into the future. So this is one scenario of land loss. We're looking at decadal change in terms of the rate that land is being lost. And each decade, what you can see is consistently negative land loss. So these processes are continuing. But when we put the projects into place, what we see is that rate start to slow. Eventually, the land loss rate stops. And then at least in one scenario, we actually started to see some land building. It's a different coastal landscape than what we saw before, because that land building is not where it was before. But we do start to see land building. Now, this is the moderate scenario. If we take a more extreme scenario, we still see land loss, even with the plan, but it's at a much lower rate. So just to quickly summarize, this was a plan that through this process and through the science that was brought in, both in terms of coastal change and in terms of this very systematic benefits and cost assessment, eventually the state reached a consensus plan that was actually passed unanimously by the state legislature, which we were very surprised by. Yeah. And subsequent to that, and with the Deepwater Horizon spill, the state has already sort of pre-committed to a lot of the funds that are coming from the settlements to projects identified in the plan. So this is something that they're committed to doing, and the plan provides a roadmap for which, as new basically buckets of money come in, can be applied directly to the projects in the plan. It provides that framework. Now, of course, the state does not have $50 billion. So one of the interesting parts here is how this plays out and how, as future funding emerges, how it plugs in here. But as I said, this provides a very important roadmap and a marker about how that money should be spent when there are new opportunities that emerge. This is going to be updated every 5 years. So right now we're in the process of helping the state develop the next master plan, 2017, which is going to include a whole bunch of new and revised modeling, particularly on the ecosystem side, as well as some new project proposals. One of those project proposals is actually going to be the result of a design competition for the lower Mississippi. that is designed to actually look at replumbing the Mississippi in a more broad scale. So those river diversions I described before, thinking about taking that to the next scale and saying, well, what if we reimagine how to use the bottom part of the delta, especially below New Orleans, and how might that help us create a more sustainable landscape? And the goal is to evaluate that formally within the same framework that these other projects have been evaluated in.